Hello guys, it's the Mighty Deborah back with another video. And in this one, I'll be covering something. This is very important. It'll be an informative video. It will be talking about, well, as you can see in the title, how Lolicon doesn't equate to pedophilia. There's this debate about it. It's on Twitter or X or whatever you call it. On Facebook, on Instagram, on Bluesky or Blue Sky. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. And I think that this arises from a misunderstanding about what Lolicon is. I'm not going to go into a deep dive on what Lolicon is. All I will say is that from what I understand, it is about a petite body type, and in context to anime, it's about stylized drawings of moe characters, like short, stubby characters. Now, not all of them are flat. They could be, big in the chest or the butt. These are called opie lollies. Yeah. Well, at least for the breasts. I'm not sure if there's a term for big butt lollies, but you get the point. Anyway, let's just begin. And hopefully you get something out of this. Because I was surprised myself looking at this. So let's begin.
there's a name that comes up in your work quite a bit. So I want to ask, who is Tsutomu Miyazaki?
Tsutomu Miyazaki, or Miyazaki Tsutomu in the Japanese order, either way, Miyazaki was a man who in the late 1980s, in 1988 and 89, kidnapped, murdered, mutilated, and molested 4 girls between the age of 4 and 7. So he's a horrific serial killer and a serial sexual predator. One of the most infamous in Japanese history for a couple reasons. One is that he captured the sort of attention of the media in a kind of way that hadn't really happened for quite a while leading up to this. So he sort of terrorized the families by sending them letters with cutout text from the newspaper and so on, and even sending them parts of his victims and so on. And so he was a kind of spectacular, performative serial killer, as many are, and he captured the imagination of people who were really fearful of this in a nation that's really well-known, renowned for very low crime rates. Even more so violent crime rates, even more so sexual violent crime rates, even more so sexual violent crime against young people. And so because all these statistics didn't really suggest that this was going to happen, there was a lot of fear around this, like what went wrong, what happened? And so after almost a year, they captured this individual, Miyazaki, and turned out that he was an avid media fan. So he had lots and lots of videotapes, some that he had bought, others that he had recorded. He had a lot of technology, printers, things like that. And so he kind of was this folk devil, if you will, to use that kind of language of the moral panic. So he was an individual that embodied a lot of fears at the time. So we're all consumers, right? We're all media fans, right? We're all collectors to some extent, right? He was all of these things, but in a way that was terrifying. It seemed like this had really messed him up. So one of the things that really stood out about him, his physical deformities, his relationship or non-relationship with his family, his being bullied, all these things kind of were, of course, central to what went on, but this really stood out for a lot of people. The idea that he had thousands, almost 6,000 videotapes. And from here, an interesting thing happens. So instead of saying horror films, for example, are responsible for this, instead it shifted a little bit and it became, well, what makes him different is a kind of, he consumes different media to a different extent, was the narrative. And so he became sort of known as a manga anime fan. He had gone to the comic market, he had produced fanzines, he owned manga magazines and anime tapes, as at this point many people did. But this kind of stood out to a lot of reporters who began to sort of talk about this dangerous, again, a dangerous population, and that became known as the otaku generation, Miyazaki as an otaku, but also kind of the specter of the otaku killer. So to return to some of the earlier things we were discussing, the kind of population, the dangerous population, the ways in which it seemed like he had lost track of what was real and what was fictional. He had kind of learned from the media, acted it out, and then returned it to the media. So Miyazaki Tsutomu sort of started that in the mainstream media. He became the sort of poster boy for the dangerous otaku generation. But there's also a competing one, and that competing image is of the manga anime fan who's not confused about the difference between fiction and reality. In fact, he knows the distinction, and he insists on it, and he's attracted to fiction as such. Among manga anime fans, there was a sort of movement of people who were very interested in the characters of manga and anime. And they weren't just interested in, the stories around them. They were interested in the characters themselves. They were like, this character is great. I want to draw fanzines about this character. I want figurines of this character. If there's no figurines, I'll make the figurines. I'll do garage kits. There's an outpouring of affection for characters. And there sort of emerged a genre of magazine, niche magazine, that was focusing specifically on these fans by giving sort of pin-up images of these girls. So people would draw manga anime characters as idols and talk about them as two-dimensional idols. And these fans, these manga anime fans, were really excited about this. They're celebrating these characters, which are so-called Shoujo characters, the cute girl characters. So the emergence of those characters in the late 70s, early 1980s sort of set the ground. So the explosion of interest in those characters was sort of reflected in magazines like Manga Buriko, which was about these pinup girls, these anime pinup girls. And so people looked at this and they said, whoa, that is some pretty weird stuff, isn't it? They said. isn't it strange that these people are, so excited by these characters who actually treat them like idols, right? Who are oriented towards them, who take them as sex objects, as sex symbols. Wow, I mean, they don't have interest in the real thing. They've chosen the two-dimensional. They have a two-dimensional complex, the discourse said. You know what? These guys with the two-dimensional complex, they're weird enough that we need to sort of separate them out from the rest of us. They'll be the otaku. So that was the beginning of that discourse. That was the first time the term was used as a negative label. So it was manga anime fans calling other manga anime fans weirdos. And what was weird about them was they were attracted to, oriented towards, open to the effect of fictional characters, manga anime characters. So that discourse of the two-dimensionally oriented fan, manga anime fan, as the otaku, exists side by side with that other discourse, which is the Miyazaki Stomu discourse. And that really overshadows this other one, which is in some ways, I think, quite unfortunate, because these two things could not be more separate. So, for example, in the late 70s, early 80s, Lolicon was in many ways almost synonymous with two-dimensional complex. So if you were attracted to, oriented towards the manga anime character, and if that was kind of, it's considered to be pathological, they would say, okay, that person has a two-dimensional complex, that person is a lolicon, that person is an otaku, right? So it was very central to that original sort of debate about the orientation of desire towards fiction. So once again, we have this kind of confusion, right? We have, on the one hand, that kind of two-dimensionally oriented fan and what Lolicon meant in that sense. And then we have this other one, which is from the sort of Miyazaki Stomu lineage, and that's Lolicon as the potentially predatory manga anime fan. Because the conflation of these two, or the overshadowing of the one by the other, makes it very, very difficult to have any sort of discussion about what exactly is going on. And so what Moe did, to return to that, what's fascinating about Moe is it once again insists on the fictional character, right? So the people who are responding this way are saying it's the fictional character that I'm responding to, not as a replacement or as a, in some way a stand-in for something more real. No, it's the character that I'm responding to. So that kind of insistence on the relationship with the character makes crystal clear, what was already clear, that there's a distinction between three-dimensional and two-dimensional in this kind of fan community. And that sort of got muddled along the way by a lot of negative publicity and press. And I think what happens in a lot of the reporting today is people sort of will focus on one or not the other, or they'll confuse the two for one another, they'll sort of weave them together. And this, I think, makes it very, very difficult to, again, have a productive discussion. The majority of manga anime fans do not seem confused about this. They've developed literacies. They know when they're watching cartoons. They've grown up with cartoons. They'll tell you everything you want to know about cartoons. And if you insist that there's no difference between fiction and reality, they'll carefully and slowly tell you, if you hear them, that you're confused. They're not confused, you're confused. I think that's actually an interesting debate to have, right? So what I tried to do with for example, the Moe Manifesto was just listen, right? So hear their words, translate their words, and put it out there. So now we can actually say, maybe we're not hearing what they're saying. Maybe we need to rethink what we thought was common sense, what we think is so clearly a problem. And this might in fact allow us to then ask questions that would make more sense to the manga anime fans instead of sort of judging them without ever bothering to engage them in conversation. One thing about manga anime at this time of incredible sort of growth and sort of the spread, and we're all more and more connected to each other, is I think we're sort of getting that infrastructure that helps us to sort of have these communications. I mean, there's a lot of people who are learning translation, who are helping to sort of have discussions across those linguistic barriers. So we're, I think now more than ever, having sort of robust discussions about media, and I think it doesn't have to happen in these closed spaces of the conference or the academic publication, the university. And I think instead we might be thinking about how this infrastructure, which is coming together so beautifully, might be in fact kind of giving us the chance to really think with each other in a way that would be very productive. So I encourage everyone who's interested in sort of manga anime and all that sort of thing, but especially in sort of thinking through these things with others. You know, you don't have to necessarily go somewhere else and do that, or, you know, think through theory to do that. You can also engage people in interesting discussions, and that helps to open up these spaces where we can then develop literacies in language and so on, to then speak with increasingly more and more nuance to really get to points that will will really help us all to think and move and live together.
What seems to be quite a controversy. So you've got this paper in Image and Narrative about what seems to be quite a controversial topic. So I guess the question now ends up being, what is Lolicon?
So Lolicon is a term, it's just an abbreviation of Lolita complex, so a Japanese sort of neologism. That is misleading though. So it is very difficult to start discussion about this, because when you hear Lolita complex, immediately what comes to mind is the novel, and then of course the films and the cultural phenomenon that's so familiar to us in North America and Europe and other parts of the world. So I think we have in our mind that that's what Lolita complex means, that image of the older man who's lusting after a young girl. And in the case of the novel and film, it's pretty explicit that this is a sexual desire, and it ends up sort of with abuse, a horrific kind of relationship of abuse. And so I think that's in the back of a lot of people's minds when they hear the term Lolita complex, and in fact has sort of become a buzzword in global discussions of child abuse materials, whether it be film or photography or novels or fiction or cartoons even. And so Lolita complex has become one of those buzzwords, especially associated, oddly enough, with Japan, because Japan didn't write that novel or produce those films, but there's a phenomenon of sort of young, cute characters, female characters in comics and cartoons, which get picked up in this. And so you sort of have Japan standing in for Lolita complex in the global imagination of child abuse. And I think when you start at that point, when you start with the term with that particular understanding, you miss a lot of what is going on historically and locally in Japan, which has a little bit more to do with what the term came to mean in local context and less what it means for critics in North America, Europe, and other parts of the world. So it's a borrowed term, sort of took specific meanings within particular subcultures of Japan. And the most obvious example of this would be Lolita fashion, right? So it's tied in some ways to that image of Lolita, correct? And it's often picked up as kind of an example, again, of youthful underage sexuality in Japan, how this is part of, again, a problematic objectification, desiring of underage girls. However, if you talk to the people who are involved in Lolita fashion subculture in Japan, they would say that's absolutely not what it means. It does not mean older men lusting after younger girls. It's kind of a relationship of objectification. It has to do with my use of fashion to express myself, and it has to do with a lot of sort of Rococo and Shoujo manga and all kinds of other sorts of images that are taken and sort of put together into this particular image that's part of their subcultural identity. So even though the term is the same, it means something completely different to that subculture. That's just one example of how Lolita has a different meaning. In my own research, I've come to sort of focus on manga anime fans. And manga anime fans had a very distinct meaning of Lolicon. For them, in the 1970s and the 1980s, it was more associated with their desire for fictional characters, specifically Shoujo, or cute girl characters. So there was kind of, in some ways, men and girls, but very distinctly it was men and women as well, but it was manga anime fans talking about their desire, their affection for manga anime characters. So Lolicon in that sense had a specific meaning, which does not mean the same thing as it would in other parts of the world. So when you see someone who says, as sometimes people do, I'm a Lolicon in Japan, they might say this quite openly. This is not a confession of potential predatory desire or pedophilia. What they mean, most often, is I have affection for this particular kind of character, a manga anime character of a particular type. So in some ways, the words encourage us to think of it in a particular kind of way, because we hear those words and we say, it's just a Japanese version of what I already know. just a Japanese pronunciation of what I've already heard before, right? The term that I know I should be critical of, that I know I should be really disturbed by, upset by, because it in fact indexes this abuse. However, my research has put me into contact with so-called Lolicon, with manga anime fans, for a long time. And these people with a Lolita complex, a Lolicon in their sense of the term, have taught me to sort of check my assumptions and try to hear what they're saying. And in this kind of gamble of not assuming and instead listening, I've come to understand it in a very different way. So, when you look at a lot of the characters that are popular among female fans, it's similar, right? You have younger male characters who are also cute, right? Often beautiful characters, but cute characters as well. So because the manga anime scene in Japan is a kind of youthful scene, you have, within the fiction itself, a lot of the characters are younger, right? So basically you have this kind of youthful character, and even if it's not a youthful character, it looks young because of the cute aesthetic of manga anime. So often, yes, you will see boy characters who are distinctly cute, right? And they are the object of female affection as well. So I do believe that it's not necessarily, or even usually, limited to men, right? You have women who are producing cute girl characters, attracted to cute girl characters, men who are producing and attracted to cute male characters, and so on. So I think, in fact, it is that diversity and flexibility of the identifications that makes it somehow quite distinct.
South Wales, Australia, decided that Bart, Lisa, and Maggie Simpson are to be considered persons, at least when depicted having sex. And so it upheld an earlier decision that slapped a $3,000 fine on a man who had images of those underage characters doing unmentionable things.
So Saito Tamaki, the psychiatrist, he gave me an example. He said, okay, there's a person who is drawing fiction. This fiction is something they desire. I look at the image. The image is of a caterpillar. The caterpillar has what appears to be a male face. It's a cute, youthful-looking face. That caterpillar then encounters another caterpillar, and the two caterpillars are depicted having sex. What am I to do about this? They appear to be boys. They appear to be young. They're caterpillars. Okay, how do we interpret this? And he says it would be a kind of gross reduction to assume that we knew what this means. Whereas if you have a photograph is of something that actually is there. So if you take a photograph of an underage person in a sexualized context, let alone engaged in sexual conduct activity, you are in fact taking a photograph of something that exists, of an actual crime, of abuse, of a sexualization, objectification of a person. What of the caterpillar? That is not a arbitrary distinction. In fact, that caterpillar and that child are not the same thing. They're qualitatively, fundamentally different things. And so what people like Saito Tamaki encourage us to do is try to understand that the people drawing, consuming, circulating the caterpillar are not the same people who are photographing, circulating, consuming those photographs. So shoujo manga and shoujo characters, girl characters in anime, really grew in popularity in the 1970s. There was sort of an explosion, or what's called the Renaissance of shoujo manga. And at that time, a lot of men began to read shoujo manga. So there was a phenomenon from the early 1970s on of men reading shoujo manga. So shoujo manga, on the one hand, is important because we had kind of a phenomenon of shoujo manga becoming a force within manga and anime more generally in the 1970s. People were taking notice of this. As the decade went along, you had men producing in the shoujo style, right? So men producing this kind of girly or cute image. You also had women who were producing shoujo type images for men. And so this kind of hybrid of a kind of shoujo type image by men and women for an audience other than young girls is essentially Lolicon, right? And the more you think about it, the more obvious it becomes. And if you think about the late 70s, early 80s, this crossover phenomenon becomes incredibly important. So, for example, people often talk about Invader Lum as a significant turning point when anime characters, manga characters, became sort of pinup girls or cover girls in that sense. So, Invader Lum invented in 1978 her first appearance, and she's kind of a swimsuit wearing bikini-clad, buxom girl, right? Many people described her to me as a sex symbol or an icon or, my first love or the first bona fide anime sex symbol, all this kind of stuff. Significantly, Invader Lum was drawn by Takashi Rumiko. Takashi Rumiko is essentially doing a hybrid of shoujo and kind of more for boys material. So what you ended up with is a kind of round, cute girl character that's also a kind of a sex object, and that's to be shoujo. Right, so if you look at Invader Lum, you can see that she kind of has that roundness, that cuteness, those large eyes that are so indicative of manga and anime more generally today, but originally was associated with shoujo manga. And so that kind of appropriation, if you will, or hybrid expression that came out of shoujo manga, that became bishoujo manga, that became bishoujo anime, that became bishoujo games, and then in general, sort of the mainstream, that kind of has deep roots to shoujo manga. And with Lolicon specifically, a lot of people have pointed out the connections. So if you look at Manga Buriko, which is considered to be sort of a flagship Lolicon magazine, right? It's where the term Otaku was invented and all this kind of stuff, right? If you look at that magazine, a lot of shoujo manga artists were publishing young women, men who were sort of drawing as women, all kinds of stuff. In fact, the editor of that magazine, Otsuka Eiji, attempting to produce shoujo manga for boys, what he sometimes called new wave shoujo manga. And if you look again, more and more, there's these kind of undeniable connections where shoujo manga sort of shades into Lolicon with shoujo artists, both men and women. Shoujo artists producing this kind of new shoujo manga for men, also for women, and it becomes kind of spread throughout the field in the 1980s, and by the time you get to the 1990s, it is the mainstream. If you look at something like Sailor Moon, it's obvious. So Sailor Moon is a shoujo manga, right? But look right in the title, Bishoujo Senshi Sailor Moon. Bishoujo is right in the title, and people like to talk about Sailor Moon as if it was so shocking, right? Oh my goodness, there was male fans of Sailor Moon. Where did they come from? It was supposed to be for young girls. I think it was from the beginning a planned cross-gender genre phenomenon. And if you look back at the 1980s, the 1970s, you can see that this was already happening. There was already men who were consuming across gender genre lines, consuming shoujo manga, and producing their own kind of shoujo manga, which was called Lolicon, which was called bishoujo manga, and so on. In the early 1980s, there was what's called the Lolicon boom, and it's an important chapter in manga anime fandom, manga anime history in general in Japan. So, there's the Yamato boom, or the Matsumoto Reiji boom, and there's the Gundam boom, and then there's the Lolicon boom. Those three booms together created, essentially, contemporary modern manga anime fandom. It would be silly of us, I think, to try to focus only on the first two and ignore the third. It's an important part of the story. So if you look at the early 1980s, the word is everywhere. You have special discussions happening in Animage and Animec and all these different magazines, all kind of using Lolicon in terms of a boom. If you look at different companies, game companies and anime production companies and film companies that are very respectable and would go on to be huge, like Enix, for example, were producing things that were using the word Lolita in the title, because basically Lolita was code at that time for manga anime sex. And there's simple ways to look at this. The first truly pornographic animation produced in Japan, what is it called? Lolita anime, right? Lolita anime. And it's not because all the characters are young, right? That's not exactly why it's called that. Essentially, Lolita meant anime manga sex in this particular moment. And anime manga sex was everywhere in the early 1980s. So you have the first series of pornographic animation, which is immediately copied by another studio that wants to make money, so they themselves produce a second series, also called Lolita Anime. You have Lolita Syndrome as a game. You have anime and manga. So the so-called king of Lolicon, right, Uchiyama Aki, who produced Lolicon work in Lemon People. Lemon People, literally on its cover, Lemon People said that we have Lolita Comics, right? Lolicon Comics. That's what we have in this magazine. So they're literally shouting it, to the rafters, right? Lolicon Comics in this magazine. Come check it out. Hugely popular and influential magazine at the time. So Uchiyama Aki is publishing in Lemon People. He's also publishing in mainstream shonen magazines, right? So he's not like some minor marginal figure. In fact, he was publishing alongside Tezuka Osamu. Uchiyama Aki and Tezuka Osamu published in the same magazine in the early 1980s. And even the kind of people that we like to disassociate from this, Miyazaki Hayao, his characters were popular among this very same group of fans. They were producing fanzines about his character Clarice from Castle Cagliostro, his debut film as an animated filmmaker. They supported his rise with Nausicaa the Valley of the Wind, which was published in Animage. So on the cover of Animage magazine, you had the shoujo characters. The people who were reading his comics were also voting for his characters in the character rankings in that very same magazine. In other words, Animage was a Bishoujo anime magazine in many ways, and Miyazaki was right there in the middle of it. Gainax, right? Their very first Daikon film, what does it have in it? A Bishoujo character who very much fits into the mold of Lolicon. They would go on to produce all of their famous works which center on Bishoujo characters that they focus on as a way to appeal to fans, including works like Evangelion, including works like Gunbuster. Oshii Mamoru is considered to be like one of the great auteur filmmakers. What was he making in the early 1980s? Urusei Yatsura. He's making an anime series that features a cute girl character, which was a phenomenon among manga anime fans. She was their pinup girl. That's where he got his start, producing or directing the series, the anime series. His debut as a filmmaker was Urusei Yatsura, the first one, right? Only You. He goes on from there to produce Ghost in the Shell. So over and over and over again, you can see these connections between the mainstream, so-called mainstream, and this kind of phenomenon that people like to, think of as fringe or very marginal or very kind of deviant in some ways. In fact, it was a big part of this. So in a way, I think we need to be aware of the fact that this isn't, like some minor blip on the radar. From the late 70s to the early 80s, there's a massive kind of movement around affection for fictional cute girl characters. And this kind of affection is a major part of the story of manga anime. But this particular moment of the late 70s, early 1980s, that moment is fundamental, crucial, in fact, to our understanding of contemporary anime. And if we ignore it or try to sort of, box it out as saying, well, it was just, some sort of strange minor thing, I think we're doing a disservice to history, and we're hobbling ourselves in our understanding of what exactly went on and what is going on to this very day. Because you have a kind of ongoing discussion, I think, among the people who tuned into that and the people who tuned out of it. So Oshii and Miyazaki tune out of it, they go up, right, into a different kind of space, right? They produce films increasingly for a general audience, increasingly for a kind of family-friendly international audience. Other people tuned into it, like Gainax. And this kind of tuning creates a bifurcated market in some ways, but both of them are part of the same soil, I think is what we should not forget. At the time, people were debating whether or not it was necessary to have more regulation of comics and cartoons, specifically comics and cartoons that depicted underage sexuality or abuse or deviance, perversity, that kind of thing. And so in these closed rooms, sometimes open rooms, they were discussing the problem of underage sexuality in comics and cartoons. And you sort of got a chance to peek at the thinking of a lot of the policymakers. Normal, non-manga anime fan, older Japanese. And they were talking about their perceptions, their preconceived notions about what was going on. One of the politicians said, why are we even talking about making an exception for this? We know what it is, right? Look at the image drawn on the page. Look at the image on the screen. We know what that is. There's only one way to interpret it. There's only one way to look at it. And it is, in fact, perverse. It is, in fact, pedophilic. It is, in fact, indexing or speaking to a predatory desire. Therefore, we must do something about it. That was the argument. And in fact, the governor of Tokyo at the time, Ishihara Shintaro, he himself said something very similar. He said, essentially, we know this is perverse. They know it's perverse overseas. Why are we allowing it? In fact, if you disagree that this is perverse, I don't want you in my city. So there was a kind of moral stance against the material, which it was a very strong, strident position that there's no way to read this any other way. And I knew from my research, this was 2010, and so I knew from my research that that wasn't the case. I was doing research on fujoshi, so female fans of boy characters, essentially, who like to take these boy characters and put them into relationships with each other. And I knew from that research that this wasn't the case, because what we're looking at are young women, many of them identifying as heterosexual, who are producing ostensibly boy characters that they put in relationship with other boy characters, and they then identify with one or the other or both or neither in multiple different kinds of shifting and flexible ways. And so I knew that it wasn't as simple as people are making it out to be when it comes to manga and anime, when it comes to comics and cartoons. So the fact that we weren't extending that same kind of complexity to this material because we were morally outraged by the content, I found to be rather problematic. I'd been talking to artists and fans and producers and so on for a long time, and they didn't tell me that. They told me something very different. They told me about, for example, and this is just one example, but when I draw the image, I become the character. So in that sense, it means something different for the person producing it than it would for the person consuming it, right? The one who sees it without the context of the panels, the story, might read it differently than the one who produces it, identifying with the character, one or the other, both, neither. So it's a kind of complexity, flexibility of identification involved with the production and consumption of these non-representative images. So because of that, there's an openness to the image that I think we need to pay attention to. I do think that there's been a lot of progress in discussions of Lolicon in recent years. And the reason why is because I think we're seeing more and more dialogue happening across the language barrier. So there's a lot of problems for me personally, I think, with having the discussion because the material, first of all, is in Japanese, it's not translated. Second of all, it's usually paper. It's usually you have to go to an archive to find these old discussions which have not been translated. So a lot of it's material, a lot of it's lost. You don't know where to find it. Someone's memory says, I think I saw that here or I saw that there. You have to go find it. A lot of it's not in the official libraries. It's not in the National Diet Library. It's not in the university libraries. You have to go find people with private collections who can show you this stuff. But I think we're seeing now more and more of that stuff coming out because we're seeing researchers who are doing that translation work. We're seeing Meiji University investing in the subculture archive, or they're going to do an even bigger archive in coming years. There's going to be decades of work to do to catalog all of this and make it available, to translate it and all of that. But I think these are huge steps. We're seeing, I think, increasingly more people who have access to the resources to become informed. And I think that's what we needed from the beginning. I think that it's just that this kind of Lolita complex, that phrase, especially in English, I think has such a strong association with the novel and the film and with the cultural phenomenon as we know it in North America and Europe and other parts of the world, that it's hard to have a discussion about anything else. You sort of immediately assume that you know what it is. And because of that, people sometimes don't seek out that other material. There's nothing available to sort of help them to see other possible perspectives and to see other routes to pursue that knowledge. So I think that we're seeing now that those routes becoming cleared. I think as we go along, we're going to see more and more of this. We're going to see people having these cross-generational, cross-geographic, cross-linguistic kind of discussions where they're going to be able to come to more nuanced points. So I think where we are right now, too often, is yes or no. And that's what it is in the court of law. Essentially, it's combative, right? It has to be guilty or innocent, yes or no, legal or illegal. That's simple, right? So when that's the frame for Lolicon, when it's being put on trial, you say, well, if it's yes or no, then no. Right? If it's legal or illegal, then illegal, right? If it's good or bad, bad, right? So I think what we need to do is get it out of that particular framing, get it out of that, putting it on trial, and say, well, wait a minute. I mean, do we even know what we're talking about when we put it on trial? And often, I think we don't. The images aren't usually available. Discussion is usually not in our language. It's not available to us. We don't have access to the creators or the consumers or anyone involved. So we end up basically formulating kind of assumptions and working with assumptions. And the thing about assumptions is that there's always room to make mistakes when you assume things, right? So rather than assuming and actually taking assumptions to the court of law, which I think is really what's happening right now, we can begin instead to say, well, wait a minute, maybe we should learn a little bit more about this. And that's kind of been my position now for several years, where I'm trying to sort of just advocate, well, let's actually try to do the research, right? I mentioned Miyazaki, the king of Lolicon. Where are the interviews with him? Where are they? Where are the translations of his works? Where are the biopics? Where are the retrospectives? They're not there, right? Because he's been erased. And yet, we assume that we know what we're talking about when we talk about Miyazaki and the moment of Lolicon in the early 1980s. And so I think that kind of erasure plus assumption and then translating it into another context, the legal context in other parts of the world, is a recipe for disaster. So I think that there's room for us to really intervene with the resources that are becoming available and to take this progress that is being made and to really make even more progress towards deeper mutual understanding.
So hopefully you learned something, and now you have a better understanding of what Lolicon actually is. It does not equate to pedophilia. Pedophilia is about actual, real children. They have souls, hearts, bodies that exist in this physical space. They're not drawings. They're not pixels, crayons, ink, pens, pencils. They're not anything like that. Nothing like that. Etc. And I'll no. And with that, that'll be all. Have a great day. See ya. Peace.